When I grew tired from running around, I returned to my room to sleep. I lived on the 13th floor of the Western residence, and Nizan lived next door to me. After a person lives in this place for a long time, they started to live like any ordinary person would in the real world. This place is about the size of a small city, and it's split into 4 districts: the Eastern, Western, Southern, and Northern District. The Northern District, Mr. Blonde's turf within the Northern District, is the split zone center, the large hall I was taken to when I first arrived. It's where the blonde man lives, taking care of all the administrative business here. Each district has its own jurisdiction system, its own rules and regulations. Each district only have 3 residential buildings where people live, extending 30 stories tall and across the district. Every room is the same size, sufficient for 1 person to live in. Everyone here, aside from Mr. Blonde, lives in the same type of room, regardless of status. In addition to the expansive residential building, each district also has an academy and a marketplace. Life here is rather dreary for most, so people often decide to enroll in school, either as a student or a teacher. Some people continually spend their time at the academy, learning many things, waiting for the day that they'll meet their soul splitter, and when they finally return to the physical world, their accumulated knowledge will become useful. Personally, I felt their concerns were unnecessary. The passage of time here is different from the world we came from. While I don't know the exact conversion, I've never seen anyone die from old age here, so I'd suppose time passes by much slower in this world. This place seemed to embody the meaning of eternity. Aside from going to school to learn, people here can also go to the market to sell and buy things. The selling and purchasing of goods is more of a bartering system, as there is no currency here. If you needed something, you asked for it, and if the seller liked you, they might give that thing to you, or you may need to help them with something in exchange for the goods. The goods in the marketplace were all provided by Mr. Blonde. If one wanted to operate a business in the building, they could apply to their district commander. The district commander would then relay the request to the leader, and if he approved, he would distribute the goods to be sold. Though our consciousness shapes our appearances, we are unable to produce something from nothing. Most people who use the market are those who have certain items they really like, others only occasionally visit it out of boredom. While each district here had its own administrative system, it stands throughout the split zone that as long as you do not kill, you will not die. As such, loneliness grew to become our biggest enemy. Just think about it for a moment. When you truly have an unlimited time to do anything, perhaps you'll find that you don't know what you should do. Everything ends up being the same. When everything is eternal and endless, things seem to lose all value. When I awoke the next morning, I was met with panicked pacing on the 12th floor and startling screams that broke through the peace of the Western District. I quickly grabbed my bow and arrow and headed out of my room. Nizan exited his room at the same time. His black hair was a mess, and his pair of bewitching dark eyes swept over the area. Following his gaze, I saw that a lot of people were rushing downstairs. When they saw me, several people fearfully called out,
"Commander, the 12th floor, something bad has happened."
No one seemed to be able to spit out a complete sentence, so I waved them away and ran downstairs. Nizan followed behind me. The 12th floor corridor was jam-packed. Fortunately, most of the people living in the Western District had human-like appearances, so I was able to shove my way through the crowd. When they saw me, many moved to let me pass. I finally made my way through, but then a scene before my eyes had me stop in my tracks. A bone-chilling feeling crept up from the soles of my feet to the crown of my head. The door to a room was opened. The furnishings inside looked just the same as every other rooms. The only difference was that in the center of this room, there was a long and slender metal pole. It was very long, extending from the ground to the ceiling, and the pole had pierced through a female body. Laurel. Young Laurel's body was skewered onto the pole, entering from her bottom, up and out the top of her head, into the ceiling. Her body was covered in blood, and the room was covered in bloodstains because the pole had stabbed through the top of her head. Laurel was nearly beyond recognition, but there was a faintly discernible mark on her neck, a small butterfly symbol that would have once glowed dimly. It was no longer lit because there was now a key inserted into it. That meant that someone had both tortured the girl and then killed her with a splitting key. That's why she died in such a tragic manner. The bloodstains around the rest of the room were likely from her killer. After they burst apart, there was no way to identify them now. Under my administration, it had been a long time since anyone had died such a wretched and bloody death. My eyes couldn't move, fixed on the sight in front of me. Laurel's hair was no longer soft and beautiful, but matted with blood. Her big, opened eyes, also coated in blood, made for an unsightly image. An anger that I'd never felt before suddenly surged through me. This was the Western District. The Western District that had always opposed murder. Who would suddenly do such a hair-raising thing? Had someone encouraged this activity? Cruelty was, after all, the only delight to be had in the split zone. Because people grew very lonely here, this world had become a very cruel place. The abilities that our bodies can make use of in this world rely on our mental force. That means that our mental force can be turned into physical strength. For example, someone with 20 mental force who used 10 of their levels to create a superhuman appearance would have 10 levels remaining. If you wanted to have superhuman powers, like being able to jump 5 or 6 meters at a time, you would have to utilize more levels. If jumping 5 meters required 2 mental force, when you jumped, you'd drop 2 levels, which would replenish when you landed. This applies in a similar fashion when people fight. One's strength is dependent on the amount of levels they have to transform. When trying to determine someone's strength, you cannot look at their appearance. Rather, you have to consider their willpower and their mental force. People can choose to live ordinary lives here. They can eat, they can sleep, but they can also do nothing if they please. Because our bodies here are formed from our consciousness, whatever you can think up goes. If you don't want to do anything, you could very well lay in bed all day, and you still wouldn't die, but the feeling of pain still exists. That's why there are always people who've grown too lonely, who decide to harm others for their own amusement. This is a world where the strong prey on the weak. It's much crueler than the world of the living that we came from. The only thing that's impossible here is to use your mental force to create things from thin air. Our mental force can only be used to enhance ourselves. Items can only be bartered for in the marketplace, and these items are provided only by Mr. Blonde. Because this world is such a merciless place, it was split into 4 districts, led by commanders with high mental forces. The Northern District is a bit different from the other districts, as it is led by Mr. Blonde himself. Most of the people who reside there are very mysterious characters. The remaining 3 districts each have their own sets of characteristics as well. The Southern District is governed by a man named Silu. While I'd been here for more than a year, I'd yet to meet him. The Southern District is home mostly to people with a mental force of 20 or lower, a very vulnerable group of people. For that reason, the Southern District rarely had any large conflicts or murders. They were all weaklings. But they say that Silu, the Southern District commander, has a mental force of 77, which is second to Mr. Blonde's. A mental force of 77 was not only rare. Silu is very strong to possess such a mental force. That's why, even though the residents of his district were weak, people from other districts wouldn't bother them. The Southern District had become known as the Promised Land. It was forever safe, and life there was simple, peaceful. On the other hand, Zhao of the Eastern District reeked of blood and murder. It was filled with violence and people out to plunder. Those who lived in the Eastern District had higher than average mental forces. Any random person there would have a mental force between 30 and 40. An average person's mental force was between 10 and 20, which meant that the Eastern District was full of strong people, and so, the feeble had no way of surviving there. Zhao was a strange woman, and she always appeared as a girl in a school uniform. Her authoritative measures were as different from ours. She permitted an entirely destructive kind of lifestyle. The remaining district, the Western District, is under my care, and it is the most half-baked of them all. I don't know what Mr. Blonde was thinking when he decided half a year ago to make me the commander of the Western District. My mental force was only 52. While it was a relatively high value, it couldn't even begin to compare to Zhao or Silu. Zhao had a mental force of 69, second only to Silu. And mine was only 52. Nizan arrived here at the same time as me, and he was also present when Mr. Blonde greeted me at the Split Zone Center. He'd arrived just an hour before me, and when he first arrived, his mental force was already 67, much higher than mine. It was a very well-known fact in the Split Zone, but as he rarely exerted his mental force for anything, and since he didn't seem skilled in fighting, Mr. Blonde didn't give him the job. On that point, I could understand, but even Yuji's mental force of 51 was just barely less than mine, though there weren't many with a high mental force. At the least, there were enough people with one around 60. I really couldn't understand why I was made a commander, and so, I'd always remained rather carefree. I didn't concern myself too much with the happenings in the district, leaving Yuji to take care of it on my stead. Yuji had drawn up the rules for the Western District, and under her governing, our district was a considerably peaceful place. Even if it wasn't the haven that the Southern District was. Most of the people who came to the Western District were like myself, not too heavily invested in things, just muddling along here. While violence hadn't been completely eliminated here, I was blind to it all. It was always Yuji who took care of it. We couldn't just randomly ask others to reveal their split symbols for us to see, and we couldn't use force to pressure others just to find our soul splitter. Mr. Blonde wouldn't allow for such activity, hence the purpose of a district commander, to lay down the rules and regulate the inhabitants of their district. But I was completely useless. I'd been a commander for half a year, yet I didn't even know all the rules about the Western District, because I left everything to be handled by Yuji and Nizan. But now, in front of my eyes, there was a once beautiful young girl who'd just been waiting to return home. After her cruel death, I decided that I couldn't continue on in such an apathetic and idle manner. Perhaps it was my attitude of paying no heed to things and of giving up on life that led to Laurel's tragedy. Sometimes, we feel that being weak isn't a big deal, because as long as you aren't bullied, you can go on living a feeble life forever. But one day, you'll come to realize that weakness isn't yours alone. When you are weak, you will bring harm to those you care about. Because you are weak, you will be unable to protect those who are important to you. Nobody wants to force themselves to become powerful, but there will always be someone you want to protect. And then, all we can do is force ourselves to change, because, whether you are weak or strong, it doesn't only affect only you. I looked at Laurel's small corpse, my hand tightly clenching onto my bow. My nails dug into my skin, and as fresh drops of blood appeared, my skin began to quickly regenerate. With my bow on my back, I ran across the top of the Western residence. The residence is extremely large, stretching on as far as you can see. I clenched my teeth and used 5 mental force to increase my speed. Like a burning phoenix, I rushed across the building, leaving behind a blazing red trail. After running for who knows how long, all I could feel was the dark, gloomy sky above pressing down on me. Eventually, I realized another tunnel of wind had appeared beside me. Of course, I glanced to the side, and there was Nizan, effortlessly running with me. Even while running this fast, he still had that loathsome smile hanging on his face. Nizan's annoying voice rippled into my ears.
Hey! Li Shen, are you trying to kill me by running this fast? You clearly know that we can't be more than 500 meters apart. Do you want to run away?
I need to find Yuji. Is she in the academy? I asked coldly.
You really must have liked that little girl. I've never seen you so serious before.
Nizan's voice was calm, at ease, as if a major event hadn't just occurred.
What? You're not planning on laying in bed all day long anymore?
He pushed aside his bangs with his hand. In that same carefree, indifferent tone, he said,
I have been running after you for a long time. Slow down.
That's what I hated most about him. He was a devil that lacked any sense of humanity. There was nothing that ever seemed to trouble him. I turned and glared at him.
Stop glaring at me. You're going to fall off soon.
Nizan suddenly stopped in his tracks. I, on the other hand, continued running wildly. When I heard him, I looked back because I'd been so angry, and because I'd run so quickly, I'd already made it to the edge of the residential building. The academy was 10 stories shorter than the residence, and so, because my attention was somewhere else, I did not notice that I was already on the edge of the building and fell. I dropped down the gap between the 30-story residential building and the 20-story school building. As I fell, I got to thinking I wouldn't end up dead, but I started to recall the pain of my body being smashed to pieces. Living in this place, we grow accustomed to feeling pain that we wouldn't have been able to withstand while we were alive. You didn't die here after all, but the memory of the pain from my limbs being broken off when I last fell off of a 30-story building still haunted me. The last time, it had taken more than 10 minutes to completely heal. The wind rang in my ears, and suddenly, I felt something grab onto my ankle. My entire body floated in the air. I turned to look up at him. Nizan, since when can you fly? As he held me up in midair, Nizan slowly descended. During the frightening experience, his carefree expression remained unchanged. He tossed me to the ground and responded lightly.
That trick, stopping in midair, cost me 30 mental force, you know?
30 mental force seemed worth it. After all, even if we were able to jump very high, being able to suspend yourself in midair wasn't something an ordinary human could do. Having a large mental force wasn't enough. One had to train extremely hard to manage something like that. Of course, being able to expend 30 mental force at once wasn't something that many could do either, although your mental force would be replenished once you landed. Even something as ordinary as jumping a little higher than normal required mental force. And every time you had to use mental force, an additional 1 mental force would also be consumed. In other words, you used up your strength a little each time you used mental force. These 1 mental force charges wouldn't be replenished until the next day. That's why there's a limit to how often we can use our mental force in a day. And honestly, there were just too many things that required using mental force in our daily lives. Moreover, using up 30 mental force for a single action left you vulnerable in that time frame. I knew all that, but I wasn't the least bit thankful to him. Had he called to me just a bit sooner, I wouldn't even have fallen in the first place. He was obviously just trying to show off. What's the big deal? I shot him a look of disdain. He wasn't looking at me though. Instead, his attention was drawn to the academy. I followed his gaze and saw Yuji heading over to us. Her head of green hair, in the light of day, left me feeling quite stuffed up.
What kind of wind was blowing to bring you all the way to the academy so early in the morning? You even dropped down in such a stunning fashion. While you were falling, I even caught a glimpse of your panties.
Yuji looked at me with a mocking expression. Shut up. How much mental force would you have had to use to see my panties while I was falling that quickly? Yuji swung her tail, covering her mouth with one hand as she laughed.
Come on then. What was able to push you out of bed today?
I recalled that I'd come here for official business. My expression tensed. Laurel died. The murder was a cruel one. Yuji's smile stiffened. She looked at me with an incredulous expression.
What?
I nodded gravely and motioned to Nizan. He pulled out a cell phone from his pocket to show Yuji the photos he'd taken of the scene. Yuji took a look and frowned.
This method of death isn't a question of cruelty. Rather, it's just very strange. Why would someone do this to a kid? Laurel just arrived in the split zone, so she wouldn't have had any enemies, unless they were aiming at you.
She looked at me, suspicions on her face. I was about to respond when I spotted a dark figure fall from the sky. The sound echoed through the air. The sound seemed to have originated about 50 meters left of us near the entrance to the academy. Something had fallen to the ground, and I soon realized what it was. Something had fallen from the top of the academy, landing with a loud crash. Without a moment's hesitation, I rushed over. The head of the fallen figure was bent crooked. The lower half of his body was covered in blood. without anything to slow or cushion his fall. The body was devastated. I vaguely recognized the person. He'd been a math teacher at the academy. They said that he'd loved mathematics when he was alive, so after coming here, he continued to study it. His body still hadn't started healing after a few minutes, so I crouched down and started examining his body. He'd maintained a human-like appearance, so I quickly found the light bulb symbol on his chest. A split key inserted into it. I frowned. While a death like this surely wasn't pleasant, this kind of situation also wasn't completely out of the ordinary. We couldn't connect it to the strange incident this morning. But soon, my mind was changed. When I turned over the man's body, what I saw nearly made me vomit. Despite all the blood, I could still see insect-like creatures wriggling around on his back. They were white and oval-shaped, a bit larger than silkworm pupa. I'd never seen the creatures before. Each time they took a nibble off his back, I could see what looked like black teeth. His back was nearly gnawed off, as if these things had been feeding for a long time. There was an entire layer of skin missing, but you could still hear the sound of munching.
What is this?
Even Yuji couldn't help screaming out. In the split zone, there only exist humans and humans that had shape-shifted with their mental force. Animals, bugs, and plants doesn't exist here. Moreover, these were creatures I'd never seen in the real world either. They seemed to be some sort of insect, but regardless, why were they here in the split zone? This was certainly a strange place, but aside from our consciousness, nothing else was meant to exist.
Presumably, he'd been tormented by venomous insects while he was alive. Since he couldn't bear the pain any longer, perhaps he begged someone to use their splitting key to put him out of his misery.
Nizan analyzed calmly. This death was definitely intentional, but who was responsible for it? An idea popped into my mind and I started to run. Nizan grabbed onto me.
If you're looking for the killer, their corpse is on the roof. I just took a look, and the entire roof is coated in blood. After he pushed this guy off, he must have burst apart.
Nizan's tone was carefree, but there was no reason to doubt his words, so I didn't bother checking the roof. The murderer's body would have already exploded to bits, and there would be nothing recognizable about it. My heart throbbed. Why had there been 2 murders in one day in the Western District? I don't have a single clue. Yuji suddenly spoke up.
For such odd things like this to happen here, there must be a connection to Jiao.
That's right. These kinds of things could only occur if that strange woman had been involved. Unlike our Western District, the Eastern District was a place where violence ran rampant and anything could happen. The 3 districts each have their own district lines, all located to the right of their marketplace, and each district has the same layout, with the residents beside the academy, and the academy next to the marketplace. The boundary lines isolate each district from the others during the day. The district boundaries aren't in effect. That is, for the 30 hours of day, you can travel freely between the districts of the split zone. However, when night comes, you can't leave the district you're in. Despite the ability to freely travel across district lines, most people didn't seem to ever leave their district, as each district has its own lifestyle. For those who traveled into other districts simply to cause trouble, Mr. Blonde had severe punishments in store for them. Just the thought of it made me shudder. Mr. Blonde rarely made appearances anywhere. His northern district also happened to be a very tranquil place, but unless there were some special circumstances, I never stepped foot in the northern district. I only ever went there when he summoned me. There's a reason that I never seek him out though. Only the 3 district commanders, along with others he designates, are permitted to call on him. It so happens that there's only one way to contact him, and it made me shudder even more than thinking about how he punished those who acted out of line. But, in such a situation, with all of the strange events that had occurred, I was forced to seek him out, using a method that made me want to kill myself. I rolled my eyes, faced the sky, and cried out, "The most handsome, invincible, cutest, strongest, and greatest leader, I'm your fan. Please meet with me." That's right, this was the one and only method that he provided for us to contact him. In the past, Yuji had been the one to call on him, and I'd been overjoyed watching from the sidelines. But now, the roles were reversed, and she was quite enjoying herself. While we waited, I wanted to roll my eyes endlessly. Then, an image of the blonde man's face appeared before me. It didn't matter to me what form he took, since I didn't know what kind of existence he led anyway. But as I opened my mouth, I realized that his blue eyes didn't carry the same gentleness and warmth that they once had. My words caught in my throat. Since I didn't say anything, he looked at me indignantly.
Li Shen, are you here to ask about the events in your district?
I didn't know why he was angry, but the difference from how he'd always joked around with me in the past caused me to simply nod.
You don't need to seek me out for such things. Why did I make you the Western Commander? In the past half year, have you done anything to make the Western District a peaceful place?
But the Eastern, as I started to refute, his expression grew furious, and I swallowed the rest of my words.
I've told you before that this place has its own rules, and every district has its own style of living. If the Eastern and Western districts were exactly the same, there would be no need for the Eastern District to exist. This isn't like the place where you once foolishly lived. If you have time to concern yourself with the Eastern lifestyle, why don't you take care of the Western District first?
My stubborn temper was awakened then. Why should I govern the Western District? All I wanted was to find my soul splitter and leave this place. He looked at me coldly.
Then go ahead and find them. You clearly know that your soul splitter isn't in the Western District, so why don't you try searching in another district? Or are you afraid? I was really wrong about you. You weakling.
Then his face disappeared from in front of me. I bit my lip and remained standing where I was.